It's a real delight to be invited to chair the final panel for this year's symposium, and I believe the title is Threads and Technologies on the Move. So I know Dave and Giovanni actually from working on a previous project with them, the project Weaving Codes, Coding Weaves, which was led by Alan Harlesius-Kluck and Alex McLean. And in fact, the project that was mentioned previously, the Penelope project, in a way is extended out of the Weaving Codes project, and maybe we'll sort of touch on that a little bit later. But before introducing them and before the presentations, Alex also invited me just to say a few things, just in terms of my own interests in the field, really. So in terms of weaving codes and coding weaves, and actually before that, a previous project called Live Notation, which was a framework within which I also encountered people like Kate, who's presenting here, which was exploring live art and live coding. My role's been as a critical interlocutor. And I wanted to kind of just pick up on a couple of things that have been interesting me through both of the two projects, which I think might resonate also with these ideas of braiding and dancing. So it's perhaps worth saying I'm a writer and an artist with no experience in coding or weaving or braiding and dancing for that matter. My own background's very much in a fine art context and as an artistic researcher. And my own research often focuses on a whole range of diverse practices that often are concerned with making tangible some hidden, undisclosed micro-movements within the decision-making of the creative process. And in particular with a specific concern for how such practices might even be thought of as contemporary manifestations of the ancient Greek concept of techne. And by that I'm sort of thinking about a very specific subversive kind of knowledge that combines together the principles of kairos, this notion of opportune timing, and with that also the notion of metis, or a kind of cunning intelligence. So this thing of metis and kairos in a way has been sort of hovering in my mind all day. Opportune timing, cunning intelligence, how might these two principles also interweave within a braiding and dancing landscape? So just briefly, just to touch lightly on the two terms, kairos, never quite sure how to say it, maybe someone could assist with that, is a term that I've been attempting to conceptualise for quite a while in relation to live coding. But I think it could be applied to many different practices that are attentive to the kind of the occasionality of their own production. For example, I've also been thinking about it elsewhere in terms of drawing practices. So drawing on the ancient Greek rhetorical conceptualization, this term kairos is often taken to mean timing, or right time, or a decisive critical moment whose fleeting opportunity must be seized before it passes. So it's not really an abstract measure of time passing, but really a kind of a time that has to be seized, an expression of timeliness or critical juncture even, a right time when something could happen. And you can see that's actually with the flamenco very much. It was I'm pointing at you, but I'm looking for the seizing of the opportunity, the decision of when to step in, biding time and deciding when to act. But the thing about kairos, I think, that's interesting is it's not only to do with the nature of the opening that needs to be seized, it also depends on qualities of attention and perception that are needed to harness that opportunity. So writing about the subject of kairos, the scholar Deborah Hawley lists a whole load of characteristics or qualities that are to do with it. She says it's things like an ability to respond with mind and body. It depends on a ready perceptive body. It emerges as a rhythmic embodied practice. It's based on principles of movement and fluidity, where learning is connected to performing. It involves an immanent awareness, embodied thought in action. And again, actually, I think this also connects to the work that Erin Manning and Brian Masumi are doing in terms of this notion of thought in the act. We could also think about it in terms of loom thinking. So very much this kind of thinking that is performed on act, thinking in the doing, thinking that's responding to the live circumstances of its own unfolding in a way. So far, a lot of my work has been to do with thinking about live coding and kairos in particular. But in particular, or in parallel to that, there's also this concept of metis. which the ancient Greeks used as a way of thinking about a practical, cunning intelligence, or even wiliness or craftiness, that's also capable of seizing these opportunities. So Marcel Détienne and Jean-Pierre Venant say that Metis is a type of intelligence and of thought. It's a way of knowing. It implies a complex but very coherent body of mental attitudes and intellectual behaviour, which combine flair, wisdom, forethought, subtlety of mind, deception, resourcefulness, vigilance and opportunities. And it's very much to do with how one might navigate situations that are transient, that are shifting, that are disconcerting, that are unstable in a way. So dexterity, sureness of eye, sharp-wittedness. And in a way, I think this notion of Metis could very well apply to most, if not all, of the practices that we'll be encountering over the AlgoMech Festival. But in particular, it finds its expression in the figure of Penelope, the kind of the namesake, if you like, of the Penelope project. And those of you that don't know, Penelope is an ancient Greek figure. She comes from Homer's Odyssey and was wife of Odysseus. And the myth tells that when Odysseus failed to return from his travels, there were many suitors that wanted to marry Penelope. And she kind of created this ruse or swerve, if you like, where she said she would only marry when she finishes making or weaving a shroud for her father-in-law. And what she did was that she wove the shroud by day and she unwove it by night. So there's this kind of doing and undoing gesture that is very much a kind of a craftiness where she had no other means of escape in a way. It was the kind of resourcefulness, a wily way of subverting the situation that she didn't want to participate in. So you can also see this wiliness, this kind of skillful dexterity or the skillful ruse within a whole range of other figures. Figures like the hunter or the angler, figures like the carpenter and the navigator, figures like the weaver, but I think you could also say the hacker. I think is highly emblematic of Metis. It finds, also this invisibility, what was the negative index reflector, I think, this must be metic in its means. Metis finds its expression in anything that is twisted together, woven, plotted, arranged or contrived. And in the literature you find references to the shimmer of fish, or the figure of the fox, or anything that's sort of slippery and changing, that's chameleon or kind of not fixed in a sense. So braiding. To braid, to knit, to weave, to twist together. As Victoria mentioned in terms of the etymology, the noun braid is also used to refer to a deceit, a stratagem or a trick, feigning or craftiness that might be seen in sudden or quick movement, but also in change of colour. So in this sense, braiding, it seems, is a very special practice that might be thought of in these terms of Metis, a practice of wiliness or cunning, of twisting and turning. So these are a few things that I'm sort of thinking about, really. This chirotic timing and timeliness, with it invention and intervention, a sense of immanent awareness and embodied thought in action, the cunning twist of Metis. So far within my own research, I've been thinking about it, not exclusively, but mainly in terms of weaving and coding. But it seems as if these ideas fit very well to also think about dancing and braiding, and no doubt will unfold more in the next two presentations. It's a real delight, actually, to hear these two guys talk about their research. I can also catch up with what they've been doing. Dave's going to speak first. Dave Griffiths is a game designer, programmer and live coder, algorave, based in Cornwall. He's co-founder of Foam Kernow, which is a really fascinating organisation that's based in Falmouth, that really looks at navigating uncharted relationships really between art, design and speculative cultures. Your background is amazing. Early years, background in weaving, bell ringing, 8-bit computers and animation, all rolled into one. Experience in both the games and the film industries, and also very much involved in the kind of live coding community. So I'm going to pass over to Dave.
Thank you very much.
Very nice to hear that. All right.
Very nice. So I'm going to stand up because I'm not very good at sitting and talking. So I'm the director of from Kernow. It's a strange organisation in Cornwall with my partner Amber, who you can see with a kayak here. And I'd like to start these things talking about what that is, because we're an interdisciplinary research organisation, but we're not sort of an academic research organisation. So the kind of stuff that we work on at the moment, we've just finished a sort of interactive sculpture of a virus where you can plug protein shapes into the outside of the virus and see how your virus infects a simulation world. And that's a collaboration with a virology researcher at Exeter University, and it's something that we've showcased at the Eden Project in Cornwall. So we do a lot of kind of exhibits in museums. A very different one that we're just finishing is the Farm Crap app, which is a way to help farmers move from fertiliser to natural manures, which turns out to be a problem where the government have basically made all these books full of tables that are impossible to read, that we've collapsed into a few options and a slider, and that seems to help. And we have the dubious honour of now being government kind of promoted as a thing, which is kind of important, but yeah. And we also do a lot of creative stuff, so we've got a few projects with Richard James, aka Aphex Twin, so we're working on some things with him, like this Raspberry Pi that sits on top of an old synthesizer and learns how to program it if you leave it for weeks. It takes a long time. And we're also working on sonic kayaks, which is a project where we put sensors onto kayaks and it sonifies what's going on under your kayak. And this began as a citizen science project where we were gathering data for environmental research. And now we've got another project running through the summer where we're using the same system but with visually impaired people to give them more confidence when they're out on kayaks so they can sense what's around them. So it kind of combines all these things together. So the Penelope project for us is one of these kinds of projects. So our role on this project, the way I see it, is to kind of do research by building things. And one of the examples of this is here. This is the pattern matrix. And what this is about, and kind of underlying the Penelope project, is an attempt to understand the minds of ancient weavers. And so to show that the thought processes that went on were mathematical and scientific. And the way we do that is to show that we have this weaving notation on the bottom, which you can play with by moving these tokens around. This is a kind of tangible interface made of wood. And you can create these patterns that are the weaving notation. And then you can see the resulting visual pattern on a simulation of an ancient Greek warp-weighted loom. And you can see that there's very difficult to tell what the correspondence is between them. So the structure of the fabric is completely different to the visual pattern that you see. And this is actually a computational transformation. And the fact that this was understood by the ancient Greek weavers give rise to support the theory that the first mathematicians, the first scientists, were predominantly women in the ancient Greek world, in Europe anyway. So at the moment we have this kind of system running. It's an exhibit in the Deutsches Museum and in the Museum of Plaster Casts in Munich. But the eventual aim is to get rid of this simulation of the warp-weighted loom. This is like a temporary measure, because what we actually want to do is have robots that weave an ancient Greek warp-weighted loom. And the reason for that is, the good thing about robots is they really give you an ability to play with preconceptions of what is production and what is knowledge work. And Ellen, who started this project, was doing lots of performances where she was trying to show people that there's a thought process involved with weaving, by weaving as a sort of performance. But people just think that you're a machine, that you're just producing fabric. There's no thought process. So robots allow us to really play with this relationship. So I'm going to talk a bit about some philosophy of the project, and then I'm going to talk mostly about braiding and a little bit about dancing. My mind has been blown today by all of this because I'm very new to this area. So I'll kind of show you how far we've got. So the sort of philosophy of this, and this is really important to us as an independent research organisation, the way we kind of work, is that, so my background's in kind of working in technology. I've worked for multinational companies and research and development places. And in those worlds, the ancient world was the 1990s, and anything before that is kind of irrelevant. So one of the great things about working on this project and with researchers who are studying the ancient world is that you get the long view of what technology is. And when you have the long view of technology, it makes you, and this is, I guess, the point of history, is it makes you very critical about how the world is today and allows us to critique how technology is dealt with today. So there's a kind of, whenever you design something for use, you have to kind of have an idea of what the future is going to look like for your artifact, for your object to exist in. And by and large, and this is a critique as much of universities as it is of corporations, this future is a kind of mythical world still of abundance and economics of endless growth. We've got plenty of everything, resources, energy, always an urban-centred existence. I don't quite know why. And waste is always somebody else's problem. And what I find interesting about this is I don't know how many people individually really believe in any of these myths anymore, and yet they're somehow really central to how things are designed, as we can see in laptops and phones and cars and whatever. So what happens if we take a different, hopefully as implausible future, and use that as a kind of a lens to design things in? So we've been looking at designing for collapse. This is why I say it's hopefully as implausible. We're not saying it's going to happen, but maybe if we design something with that idea of the future, maybe we design better things. And I think that's possible. Because what you do is you move, it changes how you look at things. So we've got version 1 of the pattern matrix here, and this was done in a very standard kind of maker way with this extruded aluminium and lots of 3D printed plastic bits. But I don't know, I look at a bit of extruded aluminium, I don't know where this comes from, I don't know how it's made. I couldn't, if I needed more of it, I don't know like where I'd get it, unless it's through this massive long chain of supply. So it means that you use things like wood for everything, so we now use this for nearly everything we're making. And there is a sustainability angle to this, but that isn't really the driving force. It's more that when you're thinking like this, you want to use materials and techniques where this knowledge is dispersed much more widely through society. That if you're using things that are too specialised, actually that's a really weak point if you're relying on that. So you want to use technologies that can be examined and reused by as many people as possible. And any information that you're creating, any knowledge that you're creating, you want to disperse that as widely as possible as well. So things like open source, this is why things like open source hardware and software and open access publishing is so important. And this is a whole area of research actually. There's lots of stuff on predicting sort of after some collapse situation, what would work and what wouldn't and things like this. So we've talked about wood being quite a good material, but it feels to me like textiles are kind of another level. And this is because a woven artifact is a digital representation of its own making. So you can take a piece of fabric. So this survived, I think, in a salt mine in Germany for 3,000 years. So completely impervious to bacteria. And you can read it. And because it's digital, because it's algorithmic, it's a step-by-step process. So you can read step-by-step what the weaver did 3,000 years ago, and then you can recreate it, including their mistakes, and you can recreate an exact digital copy of their weaving. And this, to me, feels like it sends shivers down my spine, and it feels like a really advanced technology somehow. And this is especially true if we compare it with what we consider to be the height of commercial consumer technology today. And this is an iPhone motherboard. And what they do is they paint everything black to make it impossible to fix. So if it's broken, you've got to throw it away. So this kind of technology has a timeline measured in months, not thousands of years. So this is the kind of the questions that this historical perspective bring into building technology for us. So going back to robots, one of the questions is, like, where do we begin? So this is not something that we'd done a tremendous amount of before. So where do you begin if you're going to build robots? Well, like anything, you bring in the experts to help you, the real professionals. So we did a lot of these workshops called Tanglebots, with lots of children, but actually with family groups, which turn out to be a really good unit to do technology workshops with, partly because everybody tidies up at the end because they need to make a good impression. One, it's just amazing, totally spotless after complete destruction, which I've never seen before. Adults are the worst. So we posed these family groups the question, build us a robot that will tangle thread. So we weren't going to talk about weaving, it's a bit daunting, let's just go to tangling. And so we had lots of this kind of thing. We did lots of these workshops in different situations. We did it with autistic children, and I think there was some in the V&A as well. Things at places like this. And we learnt quite a lot, because this was literally our first step in this research direction, is to start doing workshops with people about it and get them to figure stuff out for us. So it turns out that a few lessons learnt here. So one thing is that tangles are pretty interesting, and they're not as far from weaving as I originally thought. So that was one thing to learn. The other thing was, so at the beginning of the Penelope project, it's a big EU project, and we budgeted a lot of money for technology to build robots with. And it turns out that we can put that money into open access publishing because you don't need lots of expensive technology. So we did all of this with e-waste and taking apart toys and just recycling things and cheapest materials, and you can actually get a long way with that. So we did a few workshops of our own, a few Tanglebots workshops of our own. We started with the Maypole that I'll come and talk a bit in a minute. And one of the things that we found, so this is in the sort of the natural environment of the Penelope project. This is the Museum of Plastic Arts in Munich. Lots of this kind of thing going on. And what we found was, so we did some tests with wheeled robots and walking robots, different kinds. And what we found is when people see wheeled robots crashing and going wrong, they go, oh, it's like a car, it's crashed. Whereas if they see a walking robot kind of struggling, everybody wants to pick it up and help it. And there's a much more immediate connection. So we decided to stick with this concept. And this is the, so we have 8 of these robots that have come to Sheffield. They look like this. And they have lots of stuff on them. They have a radio, so a Raspberry Pi can program them and talk to them and control them and kind of get the dance set up sort of centrally. They've got a bunch of sensors that's completely ridiculous because it's for a drone, so it's really high speed accelerometers and all this kind of stuff. They've got a battery and 3 servos. But I'm not going to talk about the electronics or the programming at all, because to me the really high-tech part of this is the woven structure that they're built from. And everybody says when they see them, why is it wearing a funny piece of clothing? And it's not, it's actually the structure. So the braiding bit. So this is my current favourite method of weaving. Oh, and I'm one of these people that was taught to weave when I was about 9 by my mum. So I'm not very good at weaving, but it definitely affects my view on the world. So this is a tablet weaving, which is a technique which is contemporary with the warp-weighted loom. So I think in Europe and in Asia, it's kind of known that this was used in the Neolithic times. And it uses these tablets here. So just bits of card with 4 holes in. And when you're weaving, as I'm sure most of you know, the name of the game is creating the gaps between the warp threads. So you're trying to, and this is called the shed. So this is just a technique of doing this in a kind of structured way. So as you rotate the cards, it changes the threads that are above and below. So you have this gap you can put your warp thread through. So if I rotate the cards forward or this way, 90 degrees, the blue threads are now through that hole, whereas the white threads are still on top. So you get this kind of structure. Didn't explain that very well, but. If you're doing this normally, you kind of make these very strong braids. And this is a terrible example, but it's one I had to hand when I was trying to figure something out. But yeah, you get these very strong braids that are used for belts and carrying things. But it turns out that there's an advanced technique called the Icelandic double weave, where you rotate 45 degrees, which gives you 2 separate sheds, 2 separate gaps between the warp threads. So you can put 2 wefts through. And then you get a different kind of weave, so you can kind of mix and match these different structures together. And what this one does is kind of expose the fact that weaving is not actually 2D. Everybody thinks weaving is in 2 dimensions, and it's not. It's a 3-dimensional structure, as Arun was talking about earlier. And this is, I think, the same kind of structure. So it's a double weave. So when you change to this Icelandic technique, you split the weaves, and you can actually weave the weave through itself like this. And one of the features of this is because it's actually part of the structure of the fabric, it's incredibly strong. So we can use it to hold the servos and the motors, the servos and the batteries and things, and actually create a structure from it. And all you need is a little bit of stiffening wire, which is really just to give the legs something to push against when they're moving. And this sort of came out of nowhere really, but I couldn't help comparing this with 3D printing. So it's very strong and it's flexible, which may or may not be an issue. But unlike 3D printing, you don't need any expensive equipment, you just need a few bits of card. But like 3D printing, it's algorithmic, so it means that it's a step-by-step process that you can share with other people. And as we've seen, it's self-documenting. If you find a woven robot in a cave from 3,000 years ago, you can probably work out how it was made in the right conditions. And of course, there's no plastic in here. And as we've seen already on a lot of talks, this isn't actually something particularly new. This is a technique that's used a lot, particularly in aerospace, defense, all these kind of really high-tech places. And sometimes the media hear about this and you come up with a story like this. But what a lot of these structures are created, they're woven, and then they have some other material infused through them, like a resin, to kind of hold the shape, and then you have an incredibly light, incredibly strong structure. So I, earlier this week, had a bit of an experiment with this, with some bioresin. So it's just commercially available bioresin that's plant-based, just to see what would happen. And you get these very strange sort of solid weaves, but they're very, very strong. So a future Maypole robot may well be constructed from something like this, don't know yet. But yeah, this is kind of a more complex kind of structure, where there's a split that way as well. So, the dancing bit. So we have these 3 servos on here, so they can move the legs this way, and the middle legs move that way. And this was, after doing quite a lot of research, seemed to be the simplest way of making a walking robot. But we didn't really know how to make them walk, or the sequence of movements that were necessary. So we used the pattern matrix again to represent a sequence of actions. So we have these little sort of sequences for each motor that are running all the time. These are actually synchronized with Alex when we do performances. So when he's live coding, they're going to be synchronized with that for the music. To show you a video to explain how they walk. So it turns out that the front and back legs only ever do the same movement. They're kind of doing the same movement as each other, doing this. And then the middle legs select which feet hit the floor. So what you can do is, if you just invert the motion of the middle legs, they change direction without actually changing the motion of the front and back legs. And you can also make them turn by just adding a small bias to the middle legs, so it just puts a bit more friction on one end than the other. So we can have these kind of basic sort of starting points to make them move around. So this brings in the Maypole into the equation. So this was a photograph taken yesterday. This is in Access Space, just down the road. Our sort of first construction. And the idea of a Maypole, it's a couple of things. So partly it's an intermediate step to warp-weighted weaving, or a warp-weighted loom, because it's a bit more constrained, so it's a bit easier. You can, by tying the robots on, they kind of forced into this circular arc. But also it brings up all kinds of other resonances that we've seen with with dances and braiding, and Giovanni will talk in a minute about in the ancient Greek world. And I now know that these are called figures. So this is the first two sort of ideas for how we can make this work. So the first one is kind of a simple, so two sets of 4 robots, one moving in one direction and then the other moving in the other direction. And the idea with this is to make them so that they're polite. So one will move and then stop and wait for the others to start. No, the others wait for them to stop and then they carry on. And this has proven to be the biggest challenge of all, is this conversation, waiting for the right moment, waiting for everything to kind of reach its right place. And then, so this will create an overlapping twist, which looks kind of good, but it's not really a braid, it's not really a weave. So the dance 2, which is kind of advanced, which I don't think will get working for this weekend, but we'll see. You have a weft group which have the same kind of motion. So they're moving around and then waiting, but when they wait, the warp group will move from the inside, across their path basically. So then they're going in or out, or over or under, creating actually a true weave. And you could actually have a number of different weaves that you could do this way by how you sequence this together. The problem is that to do this properly, we have to use a compass sensor, which they have on board, to know their relative position to the Maypole. At the moment, none of them can agree on which way is north. So that is the issue right now. So yes, we're doing these 2 performances, one tomorrow at 12:30 in the Winter Garden, it's free entry, and then on Sunday at 12. So I think that's all from me.
So if it seems appropriate, should we hold on to questions and then carry on and then open up a bit of space at the end for a discussion?
Yeah.
So if I can introduce Giovanni Fanfani. He's a scholar who, like Dave, is part of the Penelope project, and his work really looks at the relationship between ancient weaving and Greek poetry making, and builds very much on his previous postdoctoral project called Performing the Fabric of Song, which was at the Centre for Textile Research in Copenhagen. I'm not going to say any more because I'm sure Giovanni's also going to talk about some of these projects. But it's a great pleasure to welcome him.
Thank you. Right, so as a representative, together with Dave and Alex, of the Penelope project, I just try to situate this presentation within the broader context of the project investigation into the technology of ancient weaving, with plaiting and braiding actually receiving increasingly attention by us, as an early instance of digital technology and as a sort of cognitive paradigm for the early Greek mind, projecting the logic of pattern in weaving onto ideas of the cosmos and practices of composition and performance. As a person working on ancient Greek poetry, my current focus is on ways in which the imagery of song making in archaic Greek lyric engages with the craft and technology of weaving and plaiting. Such an association, often triggered by the crucial notion of choreia, which we will look at in a moment, whose multisensory semantics in archaic poetry encompasses both order and variegation, or better, ordered through variegation, shows a broad range of applications. It may point to auditory or even choreographic features of choral performance, or illustrate distinctive modes of composition and structural arrangements of the poem, either or both rhythmically and thematically. Luckily, this trend of imagery is so capacious that it seems to have contemplated the very image of braiding a choral dance, and we shall look at the case here, where eventually the possibility that the creation of a textiles by the dancer through their movements may have been in some case implicated. So what is good to remind ourselves at the outset is that when we refer to archaic Greece, we are pretty much talking of song culture, what we now read as a corpus of written poetry was in fact experienced as performance embedded in the religious, civic, and political agenda of every Greek polis. Choreia, which is the singing and dancing in choral formation to the accompaniment of the lyre or of the pipe, was a pervasive medium of social and ritual participation. And the literary genre of choral lyric provides us with a body of choral song meant to be performed at specific occasion and for specific gods. Right. Yeah, the slide is somewhat summarize what I'm saying. There are in particular two dimensions of archaic choreia, which may be seen as central areas of choral poetics engagement with the domain of techne. Techne is a notion which encompasses both art, craft, and technology. So one dimension relates to the perception of a performing chorus as a thauma, a technologized thing of wonder has been defined. Accounts of chorality in both early hexameter poetry and choral lyrics seems to suggest that through a sort of transfiguration, partly triggered by the ritual occasion, the audience of a choral performance may imagine the synchronized chorister as kind of divinely crafted automata or moving stations. In brief, as an ensemble transcending the realm of what is human, just like Dave's Penelopean robots. Anyway. The other dimension pertains to the range of metaphors that choral lyric poets exploit as they present and conceptualize the song, both its structure and its performance, in terms of an artifact, and consequently the composer and the performance in terms of craftsman. Through the voice of the choral speaker, the ongoing singing and dancing of the chorus is assimilated to precious objects, agalmata they are called in Greek, crowns, textiles, jewelry, or chariots, that as votive objects or even part of the chorister's attire can be connected to the performance pragmatics, either real or evoked. In other words, the choral poet's act of presenting a self-made and highly crafted gift to a god is projected on the performed song itself, which in turn is materialized and reified as one of many agalmata endowed with sound. That's a constant characteristic. I'll put here an example by Pindar. So we have a Lydian fillet, which is poikilos, pattern, and resounding, and is offered to some important people. So there seems to be a distinctive interplay of aesthetic pleasure, order, structure, and harmonious arrangement of parts that choral dancing, choreia, displays in literary source, both epic and lyric, and that is expressed by specific clusters of terms, the most interesting to discuss here being poikilos, poikilia. The broad semantic range of this notion encompasses ideas of variegation, radiance, patterning, and is predicated of things as diverse as animal bodies, intellectual processes, cosmic order, and highly crafted artifacts of technological, artistic, and musical complexity. So what brings together and into the realm of poikilia the products of carpentry, metalworking, weaving, painting, and the dapple feathers of birds, for example, or the geometrically patterned textures and scales in the skin of snakes, seems to be, for the archaic Greek imagination, both a sort of composite and eye-catching surface, which has been defined as animated by the vibration, gleaming and shivering of light, and the perception of an underlying pattern that imposes order through variegation and the combination of different elements, materials, or colors. So in a sense, the supreme model for a complex structure where symmetry, repetition, but also diversity and multifarious appearance coexist is the world itself. So cosmic order, has been observed, becomes embodied in the pattern of the craftsman in archaic Greece. So this phrasing, the phrasing poikilos cosmos, a cosmos that is poikilos, is here in this example by Pindar again. So a golden foundation has been wrought for Holy Song. So let us now construct a variegated poikilos cosmos of words that is endowed with speech. This is kind of a case in point. Here the cross-sensory, visual and aural notion of poikilos qualifies cosmos as both the material object of the verb and as the song itself, possibly a reference to the ongoing performance. In turn, cosmos may bear here the two connotations that has in Greek of ordered structure and adornment, ornamentation. Both resonate with a significant aspect of the phenomenology of poikilos, which is the logic of crisscrossing and meandering that characterize archaic Greek artistic ornamentation through a system of repetitive patterns that capture the eye. So just this kind of logic informs a techne which is conspicuously associated in poetic imagery with both poikilia and with chorality, with choreia. And this is weaving and the related techniques of plaiting, braiding, and interlacing. And as we know, in weaving on the warp-weighted loom, in use in ancient Greece, but also on Sandra's backstrap loom, every figurative or geometric motif that emerges on the fabric is not a superimposed design, as for instance in embroidery, but rather the result of a system of crossing threads regulated by numerical and logical relationships. In ancient weaving, that is, ornament and structure coincide in a very distinctive way. So it's maybe of some interest to survey a few passages of choral lyric poetry, where the two components, which are instants of poetic poikilia and textile metaphors for poetry making, coexist or juxtapose all separately, and seem to conjure up the notion of chorality as both choral song and the performance of a dancing chorus in ways that may reflect aspect of the craft itself. Plaiting, this verb, is, as far as we can infer, the most conspicuous textile craft term associated by literary source to song making, and in particular to the choral poem as product of craftsmanship. It may have encompassed a number of techniques within the notion of interlacing, for instance, plaiting, sprung, braiding, and tablet weaving as well, all of which, with different peculiarities and possibilities for patterning, were very practical techniques to produce garlands, ribbons, hairnets, fillets, bands, all of which are items that choral dancer actually wore probably during the performance. So yeah, I put here as well some example from Pinder to give you an idea how these metaphors are actually evoked in poems. And this poem, in a way, somewhat describe their own performance. That's something interesting about that. Yeah, so in one of the examples, the second, for example, you see this association between so what in the first is a Lydian, what here in the last example is this, this Lydian fillet becomes here, in the second example, the Lydian harmonia, so somewhat there is a kind of transition between the variegated and plaited structure of the Lydian mitra and the harmonic texture of the Lydian harmonia, which was a mode of musical performance. And both of them are poikile, which is also an important factor. The interplay of weaving, plaiting, interlacing imagery, and dancing proves fundamental also in the emergence of the technical terminology for rhythm and meter. That's also a curious fact, an interesting fact. Thesis and arsis, the two main components of the Greek concept of rhythm, are originally referred to the beating and releasing of the dancer's feet. the image of the rhythmical design of sung poetry as an interlacement of metrical units out of a number of primary rhythmical types is also an ancient one, as you can see from this quotation from Plato, Republic. So one of the interlocutors of Socrates say, based on what I've been studied, I may say that there are just 3 kinds of rhythms from which all the steps movement are interlaced or woven together. So the metaphor of weaving, plaiting a choral dance crosses Greek literary history from Homer down to very, very late time, Nonnus of Panoply, and sources encompass both poetry and prose. What emerges from the following, I'll do a short survey, and what emerges is a sort of terminological consistency around this verb plaking. But at the same time, a pretty nebulous scenario in terms of elements of choreography. In several occurrences of this trope, a central aspect of the described choral performance, and that's what's interesting for us here, is the function of threads, cords, or ropes, which possibly were part of the choreographic arrangement of the choristes, who might mimic the presence of textiles or rather interact with them in the dancing. So the first instance, which lies between literary and iconographic imagery, is this ekphrasis of the Shield of Achilles in Iliad 18, and provides us with a very early 8th century BC, very early instance of the motif of choral dancing as something that can be inlaid, wrought, or woven. The scene is represented on one of the outer circles of the Shield of Achilles, where the god Hephaestus inlaid a mixed chorus of youths and young women. So on it, the famed god of the 2 lame legs inlaid poikille, the verb is poikille again, a choral dance, like the one which once in the island in wild Knossos, Daedalus fashioned for fair choice Ariadne. There youths and maidens, price of many oxen, were dancing, holding their hands on another's wrist. The choreography of the dancing youths and maidens, while holding hands at each other's wrists to form a chain, has them running in alternating circles compared to the potter's wheel, and straight line rows towards each other. Not very easy, actually, to figure out what the precise movement was. But it seems like to have been composed of these two components. So there are at least 2 ancient interpretations about the nature of this chorus, both in association with the mythical craftsman Daedalus, famous for his moving statues, for his automata. The first takes the reference as pointing to a sculpture group of dancing statues created by Daedalus. The second, which is here reported in the slide, linked the dancing chorus on the Shield of Achilles to the dance that Theseus, instructed by Daedalus, devised by plaiting or braiding together the 14 Athenian youths, 7 young men and 7 girls, after his victorious escape from the labyrinth in Crete. So in this account from Aeschyleon, the chorus of youth and maidens is the object of the verb plaiting, whose subject is Theseus, the hero whose skills in the art of arranging a choral dance are traced back to Daedalus. So Daedalus devised the craft of choreia and showed it to them. So he sort of plaited the chorus in a circular formation for the gods. A noteworthy element of the Aeschyleon is a highly mimetic character of this dance, which replicates the entrance and the exit from the labyrinth. Another account of this same dance is the first item here in the slide, Plutarch, and again there are the same, which shows more or less the same characteristic, but gives it a name or identify this dance with the so-called the crane dance. This kind of dance, as Plutarch says, as Dicaearchus tells us, is called by the Delians the crane, and Theseus dances it around the altar called Kernow, etc. This version of the institution of this geranos, danced by Theseus in Daedalus, provides some further details about the movements of the choristers. Again, the mimesis of the turns and twists of the labyrinth is a major orchestral feature of the dance in Plutarch's account, as much as the evolution and involution performed rhythmically. So there have been, a number of interpretations of this particular dance. One of them, back in the 1940s, interprets the geranos dance as not linked to the bird's movements, so actually to what the cranes dance, but to a Delian ritual featuring some kind of maze, labyrinthic dance. In particular, its original shape may have had the feature of a snake-carrying dance that from Crete was transferred to Daedalus. So the second item here in the slide, as for the performance of the geranos, this lemma geranum kos, found in Hesychius, may imply that the chorus leader of the dance somewhat pulled the choristers, possibly with the help of ropes. So this just struck me because when this morning I read pull among the inputs that in Kate's presentation, the dancer were given by the life code. Here, it looks like there is an association between the pulling of the choristers. The third item on the slide, in this account, Fericaides, the ethnography, the historic Fericaides, say that Ariadne gives the ball of thread to Theseus, having received it from Daedalus, the architect. I think this is interesting because it kind of established a connection between the thread and the creator of the choros. The choros is the maze-shaped dance floor and the orchestral movement of the choral dance. 2 minutes and I'm done. Bringing together choral dance, weaving, and maze-shaped patterns in a rather literal fashion is a passage from Antipater of Sidon, an epigram, which is a dedication of a woven border to the goddess Artemis by 3 women. At line 3, Betie, one of these 3 women, is described as the one who somewhat who wrote the girls flowering in dust. So this, there is this kind of image of someone probably in weaving the dancing of some girls, which is also another interesting instance of the same motif. So to finish, going back for a moment to the first samples of plaited choral dance, so going back to the geranos, to summarize, there seems to be a couple of stable elements in the different accounts of this choral dance. The movement of the choristers mimetically replicated the twists and turns of the Daedalus labyrinth, and the choreography of the geranos might have included the aid of ropes or cords for enhancing the coordination of the dances, schemata, in the maze-shaped dancing floor, for which Ariadne's thread, that's maybe a clue, in the myth might have provided a sort of etiology. So interestingly, a remarkable spiral structure known as Troy Town or Maiden Dance, an arrangement of stones in the shape of a labyrinth, is found largely in Northern Europe. The astonishing similarity between the specific design of such Troy towns and the depiction of Minos, of the Cretan labyrinth in the 3rd century BC, for example, coin, or the graffito, this labyrinth graffito drawn on this Etruscan vase, depicting a horseman with a Trojan spiral and featuring an inscribed word Truja, have kind of prompted historians of labyrinths, ethnographers, and classicists to look for the historical connection between Mediterranean and Northern European instance of this Troy town design. So I conclude with mentioning a study of this Troy town that may be potentially be of relevance for the image of plaiting, of braiding a choral dance. So as a result of a wide ethnographic survey of the phenomenology of the Troy spiral shape, a guy called L.I. Ringbom, in an article in Swedish actually, has proposed to see the motif as originating in a method of drawing spirals, the string compass. So literary and mythographic accounts link Daedalus through his nephew Talos with the invention of the compass and the potter's wheel. And Ringbom reads the building of the Cretan labyrinth by Daedalus as a monument to the spiral's winding form, and the chorus of Iliad 18 as a dance meant to be performed on a specific dance floor, the shape of which might have resembled the design of the Troy town. The element of the string called rope, which is a characteristic feature of this string compass, to arrange a choreography for the dance floor, would then be, in Ringbomb's proposed reconstruction, what Ariadne handles to Theseus and the Athenian youths for their exit from the labyrinth and the successive choral performance. The link with the geranos as a dance possibly executed with the aid of rope, as some ancient sources may seem to suggest, allows Ringbom to propose a hypothesis of reconstruction of the performance of the geranos, which you can see here, as featuring a rope band string and being executed on a distinctive shaped dance floor, which was meant to recall Daedalus' labyrinth and eventually resurfacing these Troy town buildings of Northern Europe. Ringbom elaborates his model of how a band string dance, possibly also a mixed dance, dance performed by women and women, like the geranos, might have been performed in a Troy town dance floor. So that's more or less how it is visualized by him. Yeah, so I think what this might in a way suggest us, so in terms of comparative forms of modern folk dances, this so-called, the Maypole dance may provide an interesting template for not only a rope of string dance, but indeed a plaiting or braiding dance, in that the result of the evolution of the dancers is actually the making of an actual braid. Right, I stop here, and I'm even over time.
Not least because the both of you are working on the same research projects and actually approaching the project from really different ways of doing and thinking and disciplinary perspectives as well. So maybe we can kind of come back to that. One of the things that I wanted to kind of just touch on very briefly though was sort of thinking, oh my God, how do you make the connections between two quite different presentations? But one of the things that struck me, and maybe has also struck me through the day, is, or it's coming back to me, there's a book by an American-based philosopher called Alvin Noe, who writes a lot about choreography. And the book is quite a recent book called Strange Tools. And in this book, he sort of makes this proposal about the ways in which we're organised by certain practices like walking, reading, but also dancing and maybe weaving, braiding, but also how art can be conceived as a way of reorganising ourselves. And I think one of the things that I was quite struck of, perhaps there's a difference actually between the two presentations, is that, and maybe thinking about through the presentations throughout the day, is that at times dancing and braiding are used as devices through which to achieve a certain sense of social cohesion or social order, and in a way reflect the dominant power structure. You know, it was interesting to see that they were used often to celebrate victory, to mark moments of the winner, if you like. And at other times they're used in a much more subversive way So I think of the kind of the tactical way in which they're used, the way in which the hacker works, where it's not from a position of power, it's actually from a position of weakness or even from collapse, actually. So maybe I'm thinking of that as a general sort of thing in the air, like how might we think about the ways in which braiding and dancing organise us from the position of the power structures that we live within, but equally how might it be within our own agency to reorganise ourselves through braiding and dancing practices. But maybe you could talk a bit about the kind of connection between the ways in which you're working on the project, and maybe even say more about the project itself.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the performance.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So Giovanni will be reciting the ancient Greek symmetric.
Actually, that passage there, the Iliad passage, is Hephaestus.
So with Alex performing as well. And this has been a really interesting coming together through some of them where we're all slightly out of our comfort zone. So doing some performance like this, but we don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's very experimental. Anyway,
and I think that's a nice example.
You kind of give a sense of a connection of the different media, which were actually the case. The fact is that we don't know anything about the actual choreography and neither the music of this ancient choral dance. Nothing. We only have the rhythmical pattern. So working on that and adding some live coding and some choreography that in this case it's exactly this one. So the Maypole, we're kind of experimenting on the association of different things. And it's good in a way experiment, but also experience for the audience. Because
I think one of the things that I find interesting from the historical research is that we're always surprised at how in the ancient world they didn't see distinctions between practices. Everyone was expected to be able to weave, everyone was expected to be able to fix things that they had. And this is constantly surprising, like constantly the awareness of the world that they had, and we're surprised because we live in such an extreme world where everything's specialised and you're not supposed to know. Kind of thing. So that's one.
I think an aspect of this that I think links well with what we have discussed during the day is that also the divide between nature and technology was very much blurred, much more blurred in ways. This poikil object of things, it's absolutely both nature and natural phenomena and Muskin and highly craft objects, for example.
So we've got it's the whole day also built up of thoughts and questions, but it'd be great to have some.
I was just wondering about the chorus as something which lots of people are involved in, but then also presumably there are dancers that are known for their dancing, their particular skills. So there's a separation between the one and the many evolving.
I think right in this period, there were two realities. So the realities of the citizen attending these ritual Celtic events with choral dancing, and maybe the symposium, which was a different way of enjoying, experiencing societal link, and in that case probably figures such as of particular dancer were included. But I think in the more broader frame of citizenship's experience of choral dancing, at least until the end of the 5th century, there were not. We don't have actually sources that tell us that were professional dancers. So it was something that the whole body of citizens were actually meant to perform.
And both genders, male and female?
Male and female. It depends on the genre.
Because women were excluded from lots of public.
From lots, but but not for example, some of these genres that was slide in the beginning. See, these chorus of maidens were just obviously for a group of young. These Partheni were only performed by a group of young girls, and the victorios only by choruses of men. And in that case, in the case of the victorios, were kind of a different concept, so that the chorus was instructed by a chorus didascal, by a master of the chorus. But for other more ritual, oriented kind of choruses, it was more an experience of the whole of the citizenship. It's both male and female. Yeah. Yeah, it was very pervasive, but we completely now can't grasp this. And even when we read Pindar, also we tend to read it as in a very literary way. So, while in fact it was performed and also orally experienced.
I mean, maybe I could also say, my own route into being interested in actually Metis isn't at all through scholarship like you. I mean, it's, in a way it's a totally different route in. I think I encountered the term first through reading The Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau. And there's a very small footnote where he talks about these tactics that we can think of, tactical ways of operating. So by that he's talking about the ways in which we can reclaim power within structures wherein we are powerless. We can see this evident within other things. So he talks about Michel Foucault's work, but he also talks about the way that we can see it in the shimmering of fish. And so there's this little footnote. So this was my own route in, which was actually from a very different perspective. Almost like, how can it be thought of as a tactical way of operating? And in this text, Michel de Certeau talks about creative consumption. How might we shift from being passive consumers into a mode of production that is creative, where we're making use of things in ways that might be different from the predetermined function that they're set out by the kind of commodity culture, which connects very much to exactly what you're doing in a way. And also the way that, Kate, you were talking about repurposing. I think the notions of repurposing of things have been mentioned a lot. Maybe it's possible to talk about that, about the kind of the politic or the tactics of creative consumption or creative production, and this using and reusing and recycling of things that were intended as one thing for something else.
Well, I think it comes a lot from the Penelopean concept that you undoing something is somehow actually, in some cases, illegal. Now, you can't take things apart because you don't truly own them. You can't fix them. You break the law. It's a totally strange situation to have set up. And so, yes, undoing this unweaving is still today an incredibly subversive thing to be doing.
And the thing that's interesting is that you work a lot with children, which seems even better, that it's like catching them at a young age to be thinking in that kind of mindset. I mean, that again is quite a conscious politic that you're engaged in, that phone generally, but within the project especially, I think.
Well, it's actually it's not as an educational activity, in that we're not teaching something, it's more we learn together how to get around some problem, and you give them a real research problem, you give them something that you're actually grappling with, and they react to that so amazingly because they're being treated like adults and being asked very difficult questions. And yeah, just giving kids a screwdriver and a pair of pliers and a bunch of toys and say, destroy all of this and see what you can find. They like that.
I was thinking around the same thing too, like you brought up like the word pole, and that's like kind of that's how you unmake a weave, right? And that's how it does. And I'm sort of wondering, like, is the next step from the pole dance, and are you going to make an untangle bot? Right? Like, how far can you bring unmaking in this process? How far can you reach that metaphor?
Well, so I think with the Maypole, you're supposed to end up with it. You don't make a weave, you then have to reverse all the steps.
We did it as kids, we had to tie it off at the end and we never undid ours.
That would be interesting to see where that happens and where it's the other way. But yeah, we didn't talk about untangling bots, I think, at some point. I can't remember. Looking at Alex.
I mean, it's also making me think a bit about kind of like the principle of unlearning, and the relationship between learning and unlearning, because actually what's interesting about weaving, coding and dancing is that actually they require a tremendous amount of learning, really, I think. That there is a skill base. I mean, I'm a fine artist, it's kind of like the sense of skill base doesn't quite exist in the same kind of way there, I know for sure. But there is a certain amount of discipline required for all of those practices, I think, which I think is, I'm curious about in the sense of, a bit like with the social cohesion, whether there is a certain amount of learning or discipline necessary before it's possible to repurpose or hack or swerve or do these other things with.
I think it's more a state of mind, actually. I think fine arts is actually a really good basis of that, and I sort of have a fine arts background, so I would say that. But I think you can either learn something, and it depends on how people are. Some people like to learn things from the fundamentals, which is, I find quite difficult to understand, like to start with the basics and then build up step by step, and then you have a whole system. And some people, and I think I'm much more in this situation, I prefer to have something that's already working, and then I'd like try poking it and break it, and then figure out why, and then try something else, and then make it do something it shouldn't do, and that kind of approach where you sort of are comfortable with not understanding part of it. So I think there's different ways of learning things.
I mean, I guess one of the maybe we can also open up into a broader discussion about the day as well at the last part, but maybe if I reflect on one of the things that's been noticeable in the day is that there's been, in some places, an emphasis on a desire to kind of recuperate a tradition where ways of doing things are passed down and shared, and we don't lose a sense of cultural heritage or cultural knowledge or cultural memory about ways of doing things. And then on the other hand, there's a definite DIY flavour, even a sort of punk flavour to it in a way. And I'm quite curious about how those two sensibilities sort of sit alongside one another in many senses. I mean, maybe this also applies to people's practices in the room, how they reconcile the sort of the DIY attitude with a sense of these practices that have built over generations. The chorus people would have learned this and been very much conditioned into this practice. There'd be no DIY in the Greek chorus, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know if that resonates or something.
So over time, is it possible that some of braiding and dancing, which were once closely interwoven, and indeed with language as being one of the things which is also interwoven, that they have, in a sense, become separated over time, and that we're seeing what we're seeing in terms of what you were saying there is that there's a creative potential in the gap between them as part of the joining or the connecting or the talking to one another has got another potential for misbehaviour, which is some of these and I was just thinking that there are lots of ways in which we can reconnect them, some of which are theoretical, some of which are kind of very obviously some are practical, but also the creative potential from this, for kind of looking at the reasons why they got separated in the first place is part of kind of the...
Like was mentioned earlier, this horrendous word craft, which is kind of awkward invention to kind of somehow, I don't know, like separate or lessen somehow something.
I mean, the other thing that really struck me as a connection was the thing that you said, which was something like not wanting to use aluminium because I don't know where it's come from, and this sense of us not knowing where things come from. But it also struck me in your presentation that this was really interesting in terms of language, because we don't know the etymologies of things very often, or we've lost that connection to etymology. And I really loved this in your presentation, that there was this really faithful tracing of words back to original meaning, and it felt as if there's a kind of a parallel there that would be interesting to think about. I mean, this is obviously an important part of your research practice to really... Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So, get into the original meaning. I mean, the etymology. Sometimes, etymology can be tricky. So I think what we are, especially in this project, looking at is like open up, besides etymological structures, like meaning of some concept in a certain time frame, which is this archaic time where everything seems to have been much more open than like in classical time. Sport healing is kind of is a good example of this. So Ellen is kind of trying to apply this notion of sport healing to ways through which like woven patterns were migrate into frescoes, so different kind of media, and this is actually an association which has never been done of this concept of quickly. So I think so. My own expertise and work is about getting every single word in place. But I think what's good with this project is that we're trying to open up and think, anew some of this association, and that's, I think, it's part of the thing of what brings together Dave and I, which is one big question, which is what was going on in the weaver's mind, for example. So there's like a broad, rich array of symbolic association of making textile with humanities and sexual power, but I think what we are trying to look at is the logic and how this in a way is projected into a number of different as a mode of composition in antiquity. So the macrocosmos, the microcosmos was the first instance of atomic atoms theory in antiquity, also brings in a lot of this weaving imagery. So how this idea really was associated with a lot of different areas, actually.
Yeah, so weaving is a cosmological understanding of the universe.
Maybe also the reason I'm partly interested in the way that you were tracking back the material language of words to the source was, I guess, something to do with the way that we can often sort of suffer this thinking which places making and language is quite separate things. So we can talk about embodied knowledge as somehow being a non-verbal practice, or often they get pitched against one another. I mean, even when we were looking at some of your work earlier, Kate, where it's kind of there's a written score and then an embodied practice. It's a very particular way of thinking, but somehow it seems as if they're actually enmeshed or braided or something like this.
I think the kairos thing, kairos, that this extremely fundamental aesthetic concept of kairos, which was the one you just described. But then there is kairos, which is a word unattested in the literary corpus, but attested by this later lexica, and it's part of the loom. It's a device in the loom which keeps together threads. That's a very nice example. And when you somewhat map onto this very capacious concept of kairos, I mean, the technological function of this kairos, it also opens up a lot of avenues in a way, and that's one part of the argument for which weaving was so grounding in a way for the Greek thought.
So I'm not sure. I could just keep asking questions, but I can see that it's sort of 10 to 5. I'm not sure. Maybe we finish this part of it. Thank you both very, very much.
Actually, I don't know where we have to go back. when you're a weaver, you beat. Is it beating when you kind of with yes, you're keep pushing down the thread. So I just wanted to make a little overlap, but I didn't know what the etymology of the word beat was. So
it depends. There are a number of words that means beat. Yes. There's one which is kerk, which is this kerkis, this instrument that beat up.
Right.
And from
But the Greek poetry is, not that I'm in any way expert, but it's all meter and rhythm and
exactly.
Incredibly important.
Incredibly important.
So the sound and things.
Yeah. And the beat in that sense, the beat of the
beat in that sense. Well, I'm not sure where all this leads, but I feel that we have generated, the possibility of moving our own practices forward, or our own thinking forward, or being forward, and taking things back to our cultures and our desktops and reworking them creatively, but going back to the simple very often, and it's from returning to very simple things that actually kind of there's a richness to opening up the simple in ways that we are often overlooked in this complex world. So I don't know, I hope you've enjoyed braiding and dancing and just thinking about the space between the two. I'm exhausted now, so I hope you go away and have a nice rest before the next part of the evening, which will begin at 7:30.
That's right, yes, at Sydney and Matilda, which is just on the crossroads between Sydney Street and Matilda Street.
Okay.
Just carry on there.
So the crossing point, that crossing point is so important. So between Sydney and Matilda, very nice, very good. So we'll meet there.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so thank you very much.